I call it unconditional love, but really that's not even it.
True.
But if it's well explained, not in intellectual terms,
Yeah, I wish we were slightly more precise with our language. Personally, I'm a smart boy. I used to like to talk and be intellectual a lot.
To say that the absolute or infinity is penetrating itself is saying too much, because that still presupposes a gap or movement. To say that it's a direct experience is saying too much. It's more direct than direct, means prior to experience. To say being is too much, because that still presupposes process or time. There's no delay at all between the perceiver and the perceived. There's no subject. If there's no subject, there's no object. So the sky right now is closer than your breath is to your nose.
There's no even a direct experience. It's closer than that. And this is the problem with using language. And this is the problem with using thinking and saying that you can't understand it. I like to say that you can't understand it. Because you can, but not in the way that you do understand normal things. Even saying that sort of thing is propping up more understanding. It's like, you can understand it in a different way. But now I'm giving that sort of intellectual, since I'm explaining it in words and language, I'm giving it a little bit of a boost to the intellectualization and putting it up on that hierarchy again, saying that there is something that can be understood. And even saying that there's a direct experience. Now you hear it. Now you think direct experience. And this is, again, just subtly propping up the idea that there's self, other, experience to be had, all this.
It's just a pointing, it's just a word. And we call it unconditional love because it's seen when that whole sense of separation dissolves. There's no conditions, there's no rules, there's no authority. It's a complete openness. You could say just the vocabulary goes to unconditional love. It's just you're never gonna know this again. I always say that you're never gonna know what you are.
You will never know. Again, Anna, always leaning in onto the you're already there, because you are. It's already perfect. And also leaning into the you will never know. Because you won't. If we have knowledge, the idea of knowing something, we have unfortunately held this concept hostage by intellectually knowing something is the only way to know something. This is how we think about it. If we don't understand it in the intellectual sense, if we can't put it down to paper, if we can't explain it coherently, logically, linearly, it isn't known. And if we always try to reverse, justify all of our realizations into our intellectual knowledge, we're never going to get anywhere. We keep propping up our intellectualism. We keep propping up science. We keep propping up physics, neurochemistry. Prop it up, prop it up. You'll never know. But if we let go of the concept of knowing being reduced to only intellectual knowing, if we let it expand a little bit, you'll know. It won't be the same way you know anything else, but you'll know. That'll be great. If we don't recognize that subtle lifting, that subtle hierarchy that's being built every time we try to express something, maybe not every single time, every time we try to express something, propping up these different hierarchies in our I can't even explain it without eating itself right now because I'm trying to not do it, but you can't not do it. But
And of course, I understand why people consider the Advaita teaching in general and direct path in particular to be heady sometimes. But if it's well explained, not in intellectual terms, but it's explained as not really that it's explained, but if whoever is speaking about it has the ability to actually walk us through the process experientially.
Yes.
It's the difference between going for a walk in the park together and describing going in a walk.
I love that he said that you can explain it, but then he like immediately ate the word, because sometimes we use language like explain or understand and stuff like that. It means specifically a type of understanding, like a logical, linear sort of understanding. Explaining means that you're explaining it in a logical, coherent, linear type of way. It's a specific type of understanding, it's a specific type of explanation. And he wants to get underneath the narrow usage of those words and sort of broaden it to apply to other categories. But we don't have language that does that. We don't have this sort of abstractable language. So generally when people say understand, they mean that in a particular way, but he means to say that he wants people who can express it not in the intellectual way, not in the logical way, not even in the emotional way, but in the spiritual way. How do you do it in the spiritual way? I don't know. We're propping up all these hierarchies, disrupting the perfection, disrupting the experience that's more direct than direct. We have to see beyond that. But how do we see beyond that? We have to see beyond that. And this is why a lot of people like to say, there's nothing to be said. You can't say anything about it. You can't. Because anything you say might prop up the idea that speaking is more important than the experience. Even saying experience might be propping up the idea of experience than the actual
The question of whether or not there is something for a separate self to do is really moot. There isn't a separate self either to do something or not to do something. But I find it so unsatisfactory to simply respond to every question with "there's nobody here and there's nothing to do." And it betrays not only a lack of sensitivity and intelligence, but a lack of honesty. It's just so easy.
The idea that there's no one here, there's nothing to do. I mean, that's where we want to go. Maybe that's sort of the idea that people want to get to. They want to embody that and feel that. But clearly, if they're asking questions, they're working in a different framework. It's a tough job to straddle multiple different frameworks. You want to bring somebody to your framework, but you have to like jump to theirs to pull them over, right? And this is sort of the exact same thing I was talking about with propping up science. So if somebody asks a question, they want proof, or if meditation works, proof if enlightenment is going to be helpful, and I give them proof, that's propping up their scientific framework. It's not bringing them over to this framework. It's propping up their framework. So in the same way, if somebody asks a question and you engage with their question by jumping over to their framework and trying to pull them back over to this sort of "there's nothing to do, there's no one there" framework, you kind of prop up their framework. One way is just to stick hard and fast in the framework that there's no one here, nothing being said, no one speaking. It's actually very, very insensitive because it's hard to really describe it. It's not quite emotional, it's not quite intellectual, it's not any of those other things. So it sort of rejects, in a sense, you can just completely reject intellectualism and completely reject your emotionality, completely reject all that stuff, and only talk about spiritual until somebody actually gets it, and there you go, it's done. I have lots of sympathy, and I can totally understand why somebody might just hold in their own framework of nothing to do. The whole point is for somebody to get that framework and understand it, not to prop up scientific frameworks or some other emotional somethingness or whatever other things. It's truly ineffable, truly. But just as much as everything else is ineffable. So that's the tricky part. Everything is. Even to say that this is more ineffable than anything else, that's separating it too much. So tricky. This whole idea about conceptualizing things being bad, it's not necessarily bad, it's just bad if we think our concepts are more important than the experience.
I agree that to describe going for a walk in the path is intellectual, however beautifully described it is. Mm-hmm. But actually to go out together and walk through the path together, that to me is the real teaching, the experiential teaching.
Absolutely, man. It's like I can talk all about music theory all I want, but we can't confuse my talking about music theory with listening to the music. I wish we were slightly more precise with our language. Personally, I'm a smart boy. I used to like to talk and be intellectual a lot, but I'm not quite so attached to it these days. However, when we're talking about stuff, I feel like we need to be very, very precise with the language. Not that the more precise language is better, and not that the precise language is closer to the reality. If we're going to be talking about stuff, it's helpful to facilitate our understanding in this more mundane sense to be very precise with our language. Unfortunately, we can get very loose with a poor attachment to the intellectualism, right? We can sort of pretend, we're no longer being intellectual, we've gotten into these great spiritual states and we've dropped our attachment to rationality and stuff. And I mean, that's kind of cute to say, but it's not helpful when you're sticking with rationality by talking and then being imprecise with your language, and not necessarily deliberately, but sometimes deliberately crazy making ways, sometimes deliberately gaslighting ways, and then sometimes just kind of foolishly allowing your biases to poison the way that you're thinking about this stuff. Either think about it well or don't think about it. That's how I'd say it. And of course, I am saying that like I want to be careful here, because I'm saying like it's important to be very, very clear in terms of, you know, if we're talking about it, be very clear and intellectual about it and do it well. But I'm attempting also to not prop up intellectualism. Being smart, being able to speak about this stuff, we can get very easily confused into thinking that talking about it is somehow more important than actually feeling it. So I have a lot of sympathy for the direct contradictions in language, so that we get a loose attachment to our intellectualizing and being rational and having linear thoughts and all that stuff. I have a very, like, I understand that a lot, and I appreciate it because it's actually very helpful to loosen our attachment to the intellectualizing. But then once we grasp that the way that we interact in the space is not intellectually, the main way that we interact with the space is through experience, then we can go back to it. It's similar, I talk about music theory a lot. It's like if you get a person who's a music student and they're trying to do everything and make it follow music theory, you need to tell them that music theory is not important. You need to tell them very clearly, stop doing music theory, just listen to the music, just play something and feel it. Because listening is the way that you interact with the music. But then after they actually get it and they start listening to the music, okay, great, now we can do music theory. And we want to do our music theory well, and we want to do it very precisely because it's actually very helpful. As long as we recognize music theory is not the music, music theory is a great support for the music. But music theory is not going to be a great support if you're doing music theory poorly, right? So your intellectualism in the spiritual space, I mean, it's helpful if you're doing it well, but it's not going to be helpful if you're doing it poorly. After we listen to the music, we understand music is the important part. We can listen to the music and then we can reference music theory, and that helps a lot. It actually supports our listening. But we're never confused into thinking that the music theory is the music. Same here, we're not ever confused that the description of the walk into park is better or more important or more foundational than the actual walking in the park. The description can help. It can help a lot. It can help us remember. It can help us see things a little bit more clearly, but we never confuse the description with the actual walking. However, when we talk about spiritual stuff, oftentimes we confuse our intellectualizing, we confuse our emotion with the actual spiritual stuff.
There's nothing intellectual about that. It's highly experiential and very simple.
And it's so tricky. We need to practice letting go of concepts. It's hard to get even beyond the idea of wanting to do to have an experience and then wanting to express the experience. We get a hold of expression and think that that is more important than the actual experience. It's really subtle. It's really subtle, and this might just be my own experience, I don't know. But you have these cool things happening, these interesting things happening, you have these realizations you see very clearly, but it's kind of muddied by the fact that you want to express it. So we want to try to get to practice for certain periods. I say very clearly that every time you study, it needs to be preceded and followed by practice. And in particular, we need to practice getting beyond our concepts, because every time we study, every time we talk, we sort of reinforce concepts. So we want to do the reverse. Let go of our concepts. Let go of our expressions. Let go of our remembering. Just have an experience and have it sectioned off as this is going to be the experience that I'm having. This is going to be the time where I have experiences, and I'm never going to talk about it. I'm not even going to try to remember it. It's just having the experience. Letting go of all concepts, letting go of everything. And hopefully that counteracts, maybe it doesn't, maybe it does. Hopefully that counteracts our propping up conceptualization as good.